to Python with Andrew. We've put together many videos on the basics of Python. And now I want to move on to the next step, and that is adding a database system to our group of tools. So we're going to add an SQL database, and we're going to activate it and use it in Python. And in this first video, I'm just going to show you what do we need to set up the environment so that we can start doing this. Now, we're going to start with an SQL database, a relational database. But the reality is we could, and I will, put together some videos where we use other databases, non-relational databases, no SQL databases, in the same sort of way. And what I'm trying to show you is that we can have Python as our application layer, reading and writing data from a database, which is that database layer. So we've got a bit of a mini stack development starting to appear. Not very sophisticated yet, but certainly there's starts of that. So we're going to have our database where we're going to define tables and put data in, etc. That's going to exist a while. And we're going to, on top of it, have Python reading and writing that data. Now, in some of the earlier videos, I used Python to read and write text files or Excel files. And of course, that in a sense is reading and writing to a database, because those files exist on your hard drive or in the cloud permanently. But they're pretty basic forms of data and database. Once we move up to a relational database or even a more powerful database, we start introducing things like the ability to do multi-user, the ability to do security, the ability to build more complex and more appropriate databases. So that's why we want to move up from using simple text files or Excel, etc., moving up to a real database like SQL. Now, I've chosen to start with SQL because it's easy to access and you can get the software for free, and I'll go through that briefly. And it's easy to connect to. So it's a good starting point. Now, I will warn you, SQL is a programming language in its own right. So there's a lot to learn with SQL. And also working with relational databases, there's a lot to learn about issues to do with relational databases. In this video, I'm going to ignore all of that. I'm going to do the real basics. I'm going to assume that we've got the simplest database possible with one table, and we're going to, if you like, connect to that table and then read data from that table. As we go along, we will expand our knowledge of SQL as we go along. So this is not a tutorial on SQL. This is more of a tutorial on how to connect to SQL from Python. Or to come in the future to expand your knowledge. I think what's really important is step one, can you connect to a database in Python, and can you at least get data out? Once we've succeeded doing that, then we have a lot more to go down into the future. Now, you will need to set up your environment. You will need a SQL database. I recommend MySQL, and I've got the link there, mysql.com, to go to downloads. You can download that database system onto your local PC. I recommend that because it's free, it's easy to use, and it has all the things we need to do. Now, of course, that is only going to put an SQL database on your computer. It's not in the cloud, and it's not multi-user, and it's not as sophisticated as what we could if we were using a more robust platform, but we'll worry about that another day. Now, with MySQL comes a tool called MySQL Workbench. And that really is a chance for you to work on your database in an environment. Now, it is a good environment. Workbench is a good environment, and it comes for free with MySQL. I prefer to use an extension in Visual Studio Code. Because remember, Visual Studio Code is just an editor. And we've been using it to edit Python, but we could also use it to attach and edit SQL. So I'm actually going to use a MySQL extension, and I use the Wei Jin Chan. He's built a really good extension for Visual Studio Code. That way I can flip back and forth between working on my database, setting it all up, but also using my Python to attach, etc. The other thing is that I like to set up the database first, not in Python code, but in the database system. So I can do all my checking and testing in the database system, and then use Python to add more data, read data, update data, etc., in a more application-oriented way. We'll also need to import the Python module MySQL connector. And down the bottom there's the install that you need to do in Visual Studio Code. And that enables us to, that's got the module, if you like, that enables us to connect to our database. So the top one is our database. The second one is like a workbench, so we can see our database. And the third one is the connector between Python. If you're not sure in how to download and install any of those, then I recommend Google it, or there'll be some YouTube videos on that. So let's just flip over to we were, and I'm just going to make that a bit bigger. Some people have said that my screen is not that large. Okay, and this is the Python code that I'm going to use. Before I do that, let me just show you what the extensions do. So if I click the extension on my Visual Studio Code, you can see that down the bottom here, SQL Server. I've installed this SQL, oops, sorry, not that SQL Server. Oh, my mistake. MySQL. I've installed that MySQL extension to Visual Studio Code. And that enables me to work with the database directly in Visual Studio Code. I don't have to learn another tool and keep flipping back and forth. And in fact, it brings up another icon here, the database icon. And if I go into that database icon, and I'll close this down, I have access to the database, the connection I've created, which you do when you're setting it up. And I can then create a database first up, and then start creating tables. So think of that as I can create an Excel file, and then I can create tables in Excel. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is create a database called inventory. And I'm going to then use it, and then I'm going to create a table. And this is SQL, the language. And as you can see, it's fairly clear to understand. But again, we'll, over time, explore more about SQL commands, and all the functionality. But the first thing we do is we create a database. Then we say we're going to use the database. And then we create a table. And a table, what we need to do is tell it exactly what the table name is, which is parts, and then the various, if you like, headings or columns that we're going to include. We're going to have a name, price, and stock, or quantity of parts. Okay, so very, very basic table, very, very basic database. You will also see that you need to describe the type of the variable, or the name, if you like. So name, in this case, it means it's a character, 255 in length, so maximum of 255. It says varchar, which means only use the space that you need. If you only do a name of 10 characters, only use 10 characters. Then price is a float, which is like we have in Python, a decimal in Python. And stock is an integer, and we've seen integers in Python. So this is like name is a string, price is a float, stock is an integer. So they have similarities to the type in Python. So the language is not too uncomfortable at this point. The thing you'll notice with SQL, you have to be very clear. If I made a mistake in any of this, I get an error. And then the last thing we can do is we can insert data into that table. I'm going to insert a little bit of data into that table just so that I can, if you like, have something to show you. And so we use the term insert into the table, and then this is optional to say what are the variables or the names of that. And then we say the values. Nuts are $1.99, bolts are $2.99, screws, etc. Right. So you can see the basic format there. That's inserting information in. Of course, if I was running my application and one of the functions in my application was to insert a new product, I would do that in Python. Right. I'm just doing a little bit here to set us up for this basic example. And last but not least, I've got, if you like, a retrieval command in SQL. And the simplest part of this retrieving, it says select star from parts. And that basically says select everything. Show me everything that's currently in that table. In fact, I'm going to run that. So if I run that, execute that, you'll see that it's got those pieces of information: nuts, bolts, screws. It's got the name of the header, and it's just like as if we were doing Excel. All right. So I have created the database, and I have created a table, and I've inserted some data in the table. That's going to help us get up and running. And I did a double check to see that it was all there. Now, what you'll see is when we use Python, we're going to use this exact same command. Right? We're going to connect to the database and use the same command and then work with it as we go along. And in my case, I'm just going to print, if you like, the table. Okay. So that's a very, very quick introduction to an SQL table. Very simple table. We've got a database. We've got one table. It's got 3 columns, and we have to have 3 rows of data. And that'll get us up and running. Now, if we jump over to our Python here, let me close some of these things down. If we jump over to the Python code, let me explain what I've done here. And I've pre-done it out just because I want to show you the basic commands. Once you've got these kind of basic functions, whatever the database is, however complex, it will still have that same format. We need to, first of all, connect to the database. And then we need to, if you like, retrieve information. But as we go along, we'll add more information and update information, etc. But in this particular program, all I'm going to do is connect and retrieve what is in the database already. So the first thing I need to do is import Nectar. That's a module. You need to install it, as I put in my slide earlier. Then I'm going to write a function, connect SQL. I need to connect it. And in this case, the arguments that I'm going to pass, I need to tell it the host, which I've set it up as localhost. and I've got a user password. I've kept it very, very basic. And optional, I'm only going to allow us access to this database here, inventory. I didn't have to, I could delete that if I wanted to. I don't need that in there. And that would give me access to all the database, all the tables in all the database. And we're going to return this connection variable. And then we're going to use that along the way to say, hey, I've already logged in, if you like, to the database, and now I want to use the database. So this connect SQL is sort of like a login to the database. Then I've defined a function print table. And the way we tend to work in an application is that we want to bring back all the records or some portion of the records, but we can't bring them back all at once, because that's fine if there's 3 records that I've got, but what if there's 40 million records, right? We can't bring them back all at once. So we actually need to go through them one by one and use a Python method or Python concept called an iterator. We'll go through one by one and work on each row. We could try bring them back all at once, but the reality is we would probably run out of space memory, or it would be very, very slow on very big databases. So in this case, all I'm going to do is print the table, and it's going to take the database as its argument. I could have taken the table as the argument and so forth, and that's what I'll do in the future. And there's a couple of lines here that you need to focus in on. And what we're going to do is effectively set the starting point to the first row that comes back, and then we're going to go through them all one at a time. So we do set the cursor at 0, or we could leave that as blank, which sort of says, let's set the pointer, if you like, at the top of the table. Then we execute an SQL command. And you can see there, that SQL command is exactly the same as the one I showed you earlier, select star from parts. Nothing fancy about that. We'll get into much better queries and conditions and all that stuff at a later date. And then we do this fetch all, because in this case, we want all of the records back. Not all at once, but we want access to them all, because we're going to go through them one by one by one. All right. And so we use the dbcursor.fetchAll method. So we've got, if you like, a number of methods to do with this, if you like, pointer. It says get them all, or keep going to the end. And the query is this select star from parts. Now we've got, if you like, a query result, which isn't everything. It's sort of like, I'll give you it when you need it. So we're going to go through it one line or one row at a time. And one of the best, if you like, data types in Python to use to match a relational table is this tuple here, right? So I've said I'm going to use this tuple, and that's going to match every row, name, price, and stock. Right? So I'm using, if you like, knowledge of what's in the database, and I'm matching it row by row by row. It's going to go through all the rows to the end, and it's just going to simply print out how much stock we have and what's the price. Okay? So that's what this function does. It only works for one table. I could make it much better into the future, which we will in another video. And now we're going to call this function. First of all, we're going to, if you like, connect, which is our top function, which is like logging into the database. And then we're going to print this table out. So let's see what happens. Let me save that. Let me see what happens when we do that. Oops, I've got an error. Oh no. Let me just check that out. Okay, I found out what my problem was, and let me just, when I deleted, I made a mistake deleting this database equals inventory. I'll put that back in there to make it clear which database I'm using and which parts or which table I'm using. So let me clear this off. Now, if I run this, we just get what's in the database. Okay, so all I've done there is logged into the database and I've printed out the database. So let's quickly review what we've done there. First of all, I've talked about what the environment is. You need MySQL. You need some sort of workbench. I recommend the one in Visual Studio Code, but other people use the MySQL workbench. And then we need to make sure we have this module installed, which I did previously. Once we've done that, we need to set up our database. And I have done it in SQL. I could have done it in Python, but I prefer to do it in SQL. I double checked it by making sure that we could retrieve the data in SQL. Then I went over to my Python and started, if you like, building the blocks to connect. I've got this connection function, which I'll keep using for all sorts of databases along the line. It will look very similar. And then I'll use this print table function. I might make it a bit more general as we go along. And then I just called those. So we can see we've set up the environment, we've created a small database, and then we've connected our application to our database and retrieved information out. I recommend at this point, because there's a lot to be done, is go through that process, maybe create another database, maybe create another table, and see if you can connect to the data and retrieve data out, and see how you go with that. In future videos, we'll extend it much further and bigger as we go along. So thanks for watching. Hopefully this was helpful. And remember, subscribe or share this with some of your friends. Thanks a lot.